Very Steve. He goes, I cannot touch that. That is disgusting, essentially. You know, he was doing it for Walt's benefit, but he was repulsed by the design. He was repulsed by of what it was. Whether it worked or not, I don't care. When you talk about this idea of care around creation, because you're doing a whole lot of different things now, but the idea of, that seemed to be something that mattered, and some people thought it was niggling details, fastidiousness, whatever it was. How do you look at that? Plain English and everything else. Where do you think, this is something you've done at Apple a lot, it's been a big core value to the company, it's been good for marketing, people feel safer on it, it's good for sales. Talk a little bit about the issues around privacy now, how you're looking at it.
Yeah, you know, Steve really ingrained in the company in the early days the importance of privacy, and it has only grown with every year that has passed since then. He saw in, I think it was at D8 that he spoke about privacy here in 2010, I think it was, and he put it in such eloquent and simple terms. It means asking people's permission, asking them repeatedly, and it has been at the heart of how we view privacy. And so, you know, we believe that privacy is a fundamental human right, and we see a world where privacy takes a back seat, and you have this sort of surveillance kind of mode everywhere, that this is a world where people begin to do less and think less. They begin to alter their behavior because they know they're being watched. And this is not a world that any of us want to live in. I think he saw that and saw that well, and I have every reason to believe that he would have put up a good arguments and good fights along the way.
Which you have been attempting to do in lots of ways, whether it's on advertising or anything else.
Well, what we felt is that people should own their data and they should make their own decision. And so what we believed is that people should be empowered to be able to make that decision in a really straightforward and simple manner, not buried 95 pages deep in a privacy policy somewhere. And so that's the way that we've looked at it, and we continue as each year goes by to try to give our users, to empower them to make those decisions for themselves. And you see the features that we've rolled out over time that do that. We are not trying to make the decision for them.
Well, you have de facto become, because of this core value of this company started by Steve, you become the de facto regulator in that regard, because regulators haven't stepped in.
Yeah, we're not just trying to be a regulator, Tara. All we're trying to do is give people the ability to make the decision for themselves. Do they want to be tracked? Is this something that they're by freely making the decision to do? And so we're presenting them the ability to make that decision. And we just keep trying to do that more and more and more as time goes on.
So Johnny, we were talking earlier about when we talked earlier this week about care and design, and that's another thing. So a lot of the stuff that's been rolled out that have been privacy violations have been rolled out without care. That's, without consequences, without intentionality, or just lack of caring about the consequences. Talk a little bit about the idea of care and design.
I think, care is a tough word in some ways to understand. I think it's easier to understand carelessness. Which is, I see, being a disregard for people. Carelessness to me is just people as a potential revenue stream, not the reason to work moderately hard to really express your love and appreciation for the rest of the species. So for us in our practice of design, I think care is very often felt. And not necessarily seen. And I think, and I know it's something that I think the three of us feel strongly about, that sort of care that is, Steve talks about, the carpenter, the cabinet maker that would finish the back of the drawer. And it's that you're bothered beyond whether something is actually publicly seen. You do it not because there's an economic interest. You do it because it's the right moral decision. And I think I think particularly as a designer, I think it's very often in the very small, quiet things, like worrying about how you package a cable.
You clearly worry about that a lot. Yeah.
I worry about that ever such a lot. And Steve worried about that a lot as well. And I think it's that preoccupation. When you're sat there on a Sunday afternoon worrying about the power cable that's packaged as a ziggy-zag thing, and you're going to take that little wire tie off. When you're sat there on a Sunday afternoon worrying about this isn't really very good. The only reason, I think you're very aware that the reason you are there is because I think our species deserves better. It deserves some thought. And it's a lovely way of, I don't know, I think you feel connected.
Right. I remember once Walt came back from visiting him when they made, when Microsoft made their, what was it, the Zune? Zune.
The Zune.
The Zune. Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, it was a Microsoft version of the iPod, really. And apparently Steve had not seen it, and Walt handed it to him, and this is what he did. Walt handed it to him, and he went like this. Very dramatic, very Steve. He goes, I cannot touch that. It's disgusting. Essentially. He was doing it for Walt's benefit, but he was repulsed by the design. He was repulsed by what it was. Whether it worked or not, I don't care. Let me talk about this idea of care around creation, because you're doing a whole lot of different things now, but the idea of that seemed to be something that mattered, and some people thought it was niggling details, fastidiousness, whatever it was. How do you look at that?
I think that Steve, early on in his life, developed out a very full aesthetic sense. Certainly before I did, and he noticed details of everything, the way that the floor meets the walls, meets the ceilings, the way that the lights are either recessed or not recessed, whether or not the sconce design allows for the kind of illumination that it's meant for. All things like that. He was very, very much aware of both the physical and the natural environment. He was animated by the natural environment as well, and I think as I mentioned, he loved California. He really loved California. He loved the natural beauty and the light of it. And the sense of openness and possibility. And I think that allowed him to have a much broader sense of what his life could be as well. I think that, people made fun of us for years because in our house we couldn't agree on a sofa or chairs. So for many, many years we had neither. But mainly because we really, there were so many details that we had to agree on. Yeah. And we finally did. Yeah. But I think it took about 8 years.
Oh, wow. It wasn't just a thing. I don't like couches. There's a lot of pictures of them without couches. A lot of,
yeah, but that's why. That was a real thing.
So one of the things was the idea of how to wield power, Tim. And under your leadership, since you took over, Apple is has become enormous. It was a much smaller company when Steve was running it. How do you look at that idea? Because one of the things that Apple's undergoing now is all it takes is to go to scrutiny around power, about the power that these companies have over people. I'd love you to sort of reflect on the idea of what the concepts were at the beginning, because one of the things Steve did was push against power, that famous ad, obviously. And he talked about it a lot, the idea of he didn't seem to like power, but now this is probably the most powerful company in tech, or one of them.
We don't think in those terms.
Okay.
That's not how we think. We think about our values, and we think about using any platform that we might have to expand those values. And so we just talked about privacy, but environment is another one. We touch a lot of companies around the world because we manufacture things, and we know that we have a responsibility to convince those companies to use renewable energy and to recycle and to do things that are sustainable. So that's the lens that we look at it through, not the lens of power and wielding it. I mean, in a lot of ways, the company is still run the way Steve set it up.
How would you describe that?
It's still a functional-based company. We don't have these many P&Ls in that where people fight about what costs are allocated to which P&L and those sorts of things. We have one for the company, and we have someone that owns software, and someone that owns hardware, and someone that owns technology, and someone that owns design. And it's a great partnership and collaboration. And it was something that he demanded of people was this idea of collaboration and the idea that small teams could do incredible things together. And you know, he ran a meeting every Monday. Johnny will remember this well, at 9 o'clock.
Oh.
And no matter where you were, you were in that meeting at 9 o'clock on Monday. And he would get the top people of the company together, and we'd go through everything in the company that was key. We still run that same meeting on that same day at that same time. And so a lot of the things that he brought that aren't talked about very much, they live on in terms of the principles and so forth that he utilized. You know, we don't sit around and say, what would Steve do? He told us not to do that.
Right.
But the reality is that he was the best teacher I've ever had, by far. And those teachings live on. And not just in me, because it's in a whole bunch of people that are there.
Give me a few of those teachings from your perspective.
Well, he was always on that Apple should make the best products, not the most.
Well, yes.
And so that looking at things from that lens changes everything. Right? And in reality, and sometimes those two align and you're the best is the most. But many times it doesn't. And many times it won't, because because products become commoditized over time in certain fields, like the personal computer business that really happened too. And we've never set a goal to make the most personal computers. We make the Mac, and we love what the Mac does, and it's the best. So we can be proud that it's the best. He had a view that he really drilled in me, that Apple should own its primary technologies. And that thinking led us to go into the processor business for the Mac. You know, first on the iPhone.
Right, it's not by Intel chips.
Right, it did mean that, because it's a very core technology. You know, he believed that you should own the customer experience in total, and that the way that a customer felt drove him significantly. He wanted to delight people. You heard on the video, and this happened thousands of times, where he would get notes from somebody that he doesn't know, and they would talk about getting our product and finding out that it did X and Y that they didn't even know that it did, and maybe it was years after they initially bought the product. And so these are still, you know, deeply embedded into the company.
Talk about most. One of you talked about the Nano. Was it the Nano, or
Nano.
That became big, right? That became
Very big.
surprised. Correct?
Yeah, no, I remember I know we were chatting about this, but over lunch, I can't remember which generation of the Nano it was, but he was so surprised to be directly touching people. I mean, I was so struck that he'd always assumed vicariously his work, Apple's work, would have enormous influence. But this was suddenly the volumes of this product, the fact that it was literally directly touching people, thrilled him. Not because of, you know, exactly as Tim described, not because that was a goal, huge volume, but to be so relevant with something that we poured so much care into.
So the idea but he still liked that it was not just impactful, but a good business, presumably.
We never talked about the business stuff.
Never?
Not really.
What did you talk about?
I told you, like hanking cables.
Yeah.
But I was, we talked about a lot of stuff that was really about how we saw the world. You know, I thought the way, actually it was interesting seeing that clip of you know, Bill and Steve, when Bill said that he was jealous of Steve's taste.
He was.
And I don't think that meant Bill was jealous of the way Steve chose his sneakers.
No.
I think it was that there was something beautiful about the way that Steve thought and about the way he perceived things and the way he saw the world. And I think there was, you know, Lorena and I were chatting about this, there was such intention in Steve's thinking, wasn't there? You know, there was such rigor. And, you know, I've never met somebody so curious and so inquisitive. You know, his curiosity wasn't, you know, casual or passive, it was ferocious. It was restless, but it was intentional. And
Right. Talk about that. You just were nodding.
Oh, I was thinking about actually when Steve came back to Apple, and Tim would probably know how many product lines there actually were and how many products there were in the 30s or 40s. And so
Too many. In other words, too many product lines.
Way too many.
so many, and they were, of course, running out of money. And he clarified, he went around and talked to everyone, and then clarified and justified the product line to be a 2x2 matrix, and narrowed it down to 4 things. Now, that meant he had to use incredibly disciplined decision-making and focus, but he also was very much driven by keeping the company in business. So he, at that point, he was very concerned about the business and used that very much as a yardstick. And I think that something else that Steve often talked about was the power of saying no. Not no to bad ideas, but no to great ideas. No to ideas that you desperately wish to follow through on, but they actually don't fit in that.
Just talking about some of his ideas, he can't do them for various reasons. Find the discipline in them. Keep going with that idea, the idea that you just don't do them.
No. So that speaks to sort of the clarity of his thinking and the crispness of his thinking, as well as his desire to make those 4 things the best on the planet, because he often talked about leaving behind a body of work, the way that an artist does.
Right.
And so he would when you want to have a body of work, you want it to be great.
So talking about that idea of creativity, one of the things we talked about a lot when we talked was about mixing the art and the commerce and the technology, which I think has been lost rather significantly. I'd love it from your perspective, Tim, when you think about what you're making now, do you think, how hard is it to marry those things without the person who talked about them all the time?
I think, Steve's vision for Apple was always to stand at the intersection of the liberal arts and technology, was to always be there. And we've always tried to stay in that spot and always think about the humanity, sort of the person behind the product, the person that using the product, and have the technology kind of recede into the background. And time again, he showed that he was doing that. And he would make bold decisions on focus, as witnessed by, I think he even shared on one of these stages, that he initially was going to work on a tablet when he saw multi-touch and decided, no, this could be a phone. And the phone was more important than the tablet. And so he took what was arguably a great idea and shelved it for years. This was not a, let's delay it a couple weeks or a year or something. This was multiple years. And iPad, as you know, people love the product.
So delaying it to the phone. He did lie about the phone on stage to us, absolutely directly, and then laughed about it the next year. And we go, did you lie to us? He goes, I did.
I think initially, Steve was very concerned that Apple could not control the product.
Yes, the orifice thing.
In a way that would make it the best product. He was worried that the carriers would direct the design of the product. And so he was very worried that that would wind up being a product that Apple should not be doing. And so it was not until he saw a way to change that that he became a huge proponent of Apple in the phone business.
He did on stage at LDC, he said, I don't like crawling to orifices, which we were like, lovely.
Yeah, I was just wording it a little differently.
Yeah, right. Well, he was talking about phone companies, and that's why you saw that picture of Walt and I going through the orifice. But one of the things that was interesting about it was getting control of that. You know, getting control of whether Bob Iger talked about it, getting control of content, getting control of things that had been in powerful positions that prevented you from making things at that time, as I recall. When you think about that, Johnny, one of the things was design, the freedom of design. How do you look at current design right now of things compared to what you were making? I know you're working on a range of things, you can't talk about everything you're making, but how do you look at what's happened to design?
That's a curious. I mean, I think we're so sort of preoccupied with what we're wrestling with that's fairly sort of all-consuming. I think the problems, the challenges are, remain the same. I do think that there are fabulous affordances with interfaces like, for example, multi-touch, but we do remain physical beings, and I do think that there are opportunities, and sometimes I think potentially the pendulum may swing a little to have interfaces and products that are more tactile and more engaging physically. Obviously, the wins are substantial to have the ability to have an interface that is app-specific. But I think there are examples where the interface is being driven by inappropriately by something like multi-touch.
Like cars.
For example.
Yeah. What would a car you design look like?
I can't talk to you about that.
I could ask the same. What would a car you
Yeah, that's a good question for me. I'm not a car person, really. So I love beautiful old ones that are no longer safe to drive. So
I find most electric cars soulless. I find them soulless.
Yeah,
I can't buy one yet.
I would say, I know you guys don't love the design of Tesla, but I appreciate the degree of its safety. It's really quite nice. But I was thinking, I would like to come back to your previous question, if I may, Kara, because I think that something that Steve always took great pride in was being surrounded by artists and poets and musicians. And that has to do with design. So you design who you're with, and you find diversity of thought, and it brings out something different in you. And it's what Tim was talking about. It's really residing in that intersection of liberal arts or humanities and technology. And I think that Silicon Valley has always been a place where people came with big ideas and wanted to come and do great things, and I hope that they're still remembering that we actually need some poetry and romance in what comes out of there. And no, I think that it's much less than it used to be.
I think his understanding and reverence for the creative process was extraordinary. I mean, I think Tim and I learned so much just going through the process with Steve. But I think that the way the process tended to work was there was thinking, which is why being intentional about your thinking, being very self-aware, but from your thinking, ideas emerge. And I think one thing that Tim and I talked about so much was the nature of ideas. Ideas are fragile. They're not resolved. If they were resolved, they wouldn't be ideas, they'd be products. And one of the things that happens, and I think one of the huge challenges, particularly amongst large groups, is that when you're talking about an idea, often the thing that is easiest to talk about, that is measurable, that's tangible, are the problems. And he was masterful at helping people of course, not ignore the problems, but to remain focused upon the promise, the vision of the actual idea. And there was a wonderful reverence, I think, that he had for the creative process. And I think most artists and designers, even if it's self-preservation, I mean, if you're being expected to produce an idea, and you know that ideas don't oblige, you know, you can't predict when you're going to have a good idea, I think you tend to need to focus on process and the discipline of trying to increase the probability of a good idea.
You know, as I was thinking about this, one of the things that I have felt over the many years is that, you know, Steve was not an easy subject. He had a lot of edges to him. But it was more around passion, and it was more around being difficult for a good reason. No, sometimes, I mean, he looks so calm in comparison to today's moguls. He parked his car somewhere weird, and that was the biggest controversy of the moment. You know, he didn't like tweet penis jokes at the president or something like that. So what? He drove his car, and I don't care at this point. It seems very benign, all the kind of some of the stuff he was doing. But one of the things I was thinking is this idea of you're talking about why you're making something to be beautiful for ideas. It's been replaced by a rapaciousness. It just has. There's no beauty in it. It's soulless, and it doesn't feel soaring. How do you think about that, Tim? Like in terms of keeping that there, because there is the pressure for earnings, the pressure for things. And you and I talked about that in one of our interviews and we don't have to talk about specific people. We were talking about Mark Zuckerberg at that time. And I said, what would you have done? And you said, I wouldn't be in this place in the first place. Broader than that, how did we get in this place in the first place? Because I do think the death of Steve Jobs sort of changed something in the atmosphere. And people that rose up, you know, for all his flaws, were not up to his speed. Maybe you don't agree with me on that.
I think Silicon Valley is not monolithic.
No.
And so it's not monolithic, and so I think it's hard to paint everything with one roller.
Although people revered him more than anybody as a.
Oh, I revere him, as you know.
Yeah.
And so I think he's a measuring stick that when you compare most people to are always going to fall short of. And that's great. He was a one in a century plus kind of person, I think, and in most every way. And he was also demanding, and he was passionate about his point, and he believed that you get a better answer by debating. And so a lot of what people might not understand about him was he would debate just to get the subject going, sometimes taking a position that he didn't even believe, and just to get the discussion going, because he was so convinced if you examined this thing from outside in a deep kind of way, in a very thoughtful kind of way, you would arrive at a better decision. And I think, yes, I think that's something that not just founders, but everyone can learn from. And I think having the learnings from him moving forward is something that is very important, because I do think that he was a one in a gazillion kind of thing. And certainly from my point of view, it changed the trajectory of my life. And I can't imagine learning from anyone else the amount that I learned from him. You know, it was just, and it was a daily kind of thing. No, he demanded innovation everywhere. Obviously, he demanded in products, but he demanded that marketing be innovative. He demanded that operations be innovative. He wanted every single thing in the company to be the best. And he had the examination ability with his thinking to go very deep on almost everything in the company. It was a very unusual skill set that he had. And so I think we can all learn from that in our own lives, both personal lives and in business.
Well, debating things is interesting, because I do think one of the things someone's asked me what the problem is, and they're surrounded by people who they pay, they own, and they don't have anyone disagreeing with them. There's no disagreement, there's no debate. Everyone is in violent agreement together, and then they feel victimized as a group.
Yes.
You know.
Where there was always debate with him. There was always debate. I know there was a folklore that you didn't debate him. That's not true. In fact, if you didn't debate him, he would kind of mow you down. And he did not work well with those kind of folks that would not feel comfortable in debating and pushing back, and it was a very different environment for me, because I came out of an environment that was more hierarchical nature, and you sort of, each person agreed with the higher level person before you entered a room, and there was no debate and no discussion. And
What was your greatest debate with him over?
probably the way the initial iPhone was sold.
What was your side?
I was for putting it in the subsidy model, and he was for the rev share. And his way was more creative and more different. My way would have scaled faster. At least I felt strongly. And so we were in quite a discussion about this for a while. It was a multi-year discussion.
What about you, Lorraine? What was yours? What was the debate you would have as partners?
What was the
With
debate
Steve,
I would have with Steve?
besides the couch.
I mean, no, I mean, we were together for 22 years, so. Pick your month, and we
So I want to finish up talking a little bit about some things you're going to do. Do you want to talk about the archive or not? Or the?
Oh, yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. So what Kara's alluding to is a group of us, the three of us, and others who worked with Steve over the years, came together as advisors, and we have a lead historian and archivist in a small group that has established the Steve Jobs Archive. And while we do have some artifacts and some actual real material, the archive is much more about ideas, as Johnny was describing, and really rooted in Steve's long-held notion that once you understand that outside of the natural world, everything in the built environment and all the systems that govern our life on the planet were built and designed by other humans. And once you have that insight, you understand that you as a human can change it, can prod it, can perhaps interrogate it and stretch it. And in that way, human progress happens. And so he would reference the fact that everything that you're born into, the design of everything around you, the clothes that you wear, all of these decisions were made by someone else. And the actual artifacts were made by someone else. And so as humans, we have a responsibility to put things back into that pool of human existence in a way that benefits all. And that moves things forward, and thereby we have human progress.
So what is in the archive? This idea of?
So we have, well, the archive will has a website, Steve Jobs Archive, and then there will be some programs that we have. There'll be other products that I won't speak about at the moment. There's a lot of, over the years, very carefully, a very brilliant documentary filmmaker has interviewed hundreds of people who have reminiscence, memories, experiences, really beautiful stories to tell about Steve and working with Steve, and so we've collected that as well.
There's also a lovely body of stuff that's just Steve, but it's not somebody's interpretation of. And I think one of the things that we thought was so powerful about that was that you actually started to get a sense of how he did see the world. And it's not somebody trying to make sense of something he said or a way he behaved. You get to see, a little note that he scratched or a way he annotated an email or a presentation. But when you see something directly, you start to get a sense of what he was thinking and why, and you realize how much he's lost, don't you, when you're trying, when somebody else tries to make sense of someone's behavior.
So what will you be doing now? my last question. We have a Zoom question from someone I know. We have some questions from the audience. What would he be doing now if he had lived? What do you imagine he'd be working on? Just guess.
Oh, I wouldn't want to guess. I think Steve was constantly changing. And so he wasn't static. He would take a firmly held belief and present it with new facts, would change like this. It was one of the great things I admired about him. He would be dogmatic about something, presented something else like this, change. And I think that is such a great characteristic of people because people get held back by their old thinking. Mm-hmm. And regardless of what new thoughts and ideas come up, and he never did. And so, you know, I knew what he was thinking in 2010 and 2011 and before, but what he would be thinking about today, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess.
No, he would be evolving. He also was quite mindful about not staying too long at the helm and making space for others. He did have fantasy teaching eventually.
Oh, wow.
And because we live right near Stanford, you know, that notion of riding the bike to Stanford and teaching classes there.
Professor Steve Jobs?
Yes, exactly.
What did I teach?
Oh, well, I mean, I think he could teach almost anything and people would really benefit from it.
Not driving. Go ahead.
Actually, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think part of curiosity, which I think defines so much of Steve, is your appetite to learn. And to learn is more important than being right. I think that goes to what Tim was saying, which is, you know, you can present with passion a perspective or a point of view.